Prose from the Underground, coming to you from my basement in northern Michigan, where I read, write, think, and say things. It's our second episode. It's just me again tonight, and I want to talk about yearning again, which is something I dealt with in more detail last time. We're going to talk about that with one particular work, and we'll finish off that topic. Remember that yearning is the engine of plot. Whatever the protagonist must have, whatever the protagonist must obtain, that's what drives the action forward. That's what moves us from scene to scene. Without yearning, there's no tension for the character, there's no story for the reader. Last time I gave a list of things characters yearn for and titles that I think manifest that. I won't give the titles this time, but I'll give you the list again very quickly. I believe characters yearn for home, for adventure, for other, for redemption, for truth, for self-actualization, for belonging, for freedom, for peace, or for normal. And I think one of these singular forms of yearning often drives works, novels, or stories, even flash pieces. Remember too that yearning, if it's established right out of the gate, makes readers into co-yearners. Once we're all on that river of craving, going to some lunatic emotional place, we roll onward, and here's the key point for tonight. Sometimes we even roll into some toxic ethical or intellectual places. Case in point, the mighty Garcia Marquez Love in the Time of Cholera, what I've called the second most important novel for fiction writers to study, to sleep with, to put on their heads, under their pillow, carry in their car, etc. Why? Because the protagonist's yearning delivers us slowly into a toxic intellectual and ethical place. In fact, I believe it's depraved. Here's Newsweek's blurb on the back of one of my copies of Cholera. Newsweek says, "A love story of astonishing power and delicious comedy, humane, richly comic, almost unbearably touching, and altogether extraordinary." I would add depraved. But here's what's key. The narrator of Cholera, which is omniscient, does not demand that we take note of the depravity. That's key for us because as writers, we often want our narrators to insist on what readers should feel about the situation. We often, in our early drafts, want to hammer the point, what should readers think of or how should readers respond to the problems here? We should avoid it. Think of your favorite cable news anchor. If you're unlucky enough to have a favorite cable news anchor, despite whatever station you watch, the job of the cable news anchor is to present the news of the day, show us the screen, the text, the person we're supposed to look at, and then the anchor goes on and performs the outrage or the snarkiness or the nausea or the recoiling, whatever it is. That's the job of the cable news anchor, to insist that we understand how we should feel. And fiction writers should do the exact opposite. Sorry. Let's get specific. Here's a spoiler alert. I'm going to talk a little bit about the plot of Cholera. If you haven't read it, I don't think I'm going to ruin the ending for you, but you might want to shut me off and go read that instead. But if you haven't read it in a while, consider this. The protagonist, Florentino Ariza, is in love. He's a young man. The novel starts out with him young, and he falls in love with Fermina Daza. They are, in many respects, like Romeo and Juliet. They're young, they're in love. They probably shouldn't be because they come from different classes. In fact, Florentino Ariza is a low-class guy. But they don't go off and commit suicide. Her father instead intervenes successfully and ships her off far away from Arisa, and she then goes off and marries a well-off doctor. Not the end of the story, however. Decades pass, and Florentino Ariza does not move on emotionally. In fact, his romantic yearning becomes infected, and he pursues every woman in sight. In fact, he even scores with a young woman in his care. So, pow, we've landed in a really weird, problematic ethical place. His serial affairs have consequences, but the narrator just keeps cruising along. The narrator doesn't immerse us in those problems. That's what's key. I liken it to driving along in a car. We readers are sitting in the back seat. The narrator is driving. Florentino Ariza, the protagonist, is sitting up front, watching us, watching the scene. As we all cruise along, we start to notice some human wreckage out there beyond the window. We notice problems, but the narrator turns up the air conditioning, turns up the radio, and we just find ourselves cruising along, increasingly thinking, what about that stuff? Narrator keeps going. That's hugely cool. I want to bring in Roger Ebert, believe it or not. You may remember the mighty Siskel and Ebert film review duo. There was a film adaptation of Love in the Time of Cholera, and it didn't work, unfortunately. Great actors, perfectly cool director, but the film just didn't come together for a lot of important reasons. And Ebert says as much. In his review, he also says some compelling things about the novel. Here's one quote. Marquez's prose dances over the contradictions. In other words, he means that as a compliment. The prose in the novel cruises over the top of difficult emotional terrain. He means that as a way of saying all of these problems come bubbling up in the story, but the narrator just keeps driving. And that's the appeal of the novel. It's a study, I think, in restraint and subtext. In other words, we fiction writers have to remember to restrain our narrators. It's easy for us, especially early in a draft, to hammer the point, to tell readers exactly how they should judge, how they should respond to the moral problems, the ethical problems, the intellectual problems, but we gotta shut up about that stuff and let readers come to those problems. Once again to Roger Ebert. He also unfortunately gives the director some bad marks. And he says the director doesn't do what Marquez does in the novel. And here's how he characterizes it. Marquez dances over the ice before it cracks. That's huge. In other words, when you read the novel, the narrator doesn't plunge you down into the briny deep of those ethical, intellectual problems. The narrator dances over the cracks. That's absolutely crucial, I believe. And it's really hard to restrain ourselves and make that happen. But it's absolutely key. It keeps the fiction, it keeps the readers involved in the fiction. So that's my full diatribe on Yearning, this and the last time. Remember that Yearning has to be established right out of the gate and let it carry the protagonist, the reader, the plot, all the way to its gruesome end. So that's it. Next time, I think we have to talk about subtext. There's a great book about subtext out there. I'll mention that, but I've got a few fresh thoughts on that may be helpful. I think it's crucial. We also, down the road, will talk about evil. We got to talk about that. We'll talk about tragic comedy. That's something that's been really on my mind a lot lately. Point of view, some other things. If you've got an idea of something that we should discuss here at Prose from the Underground, go to my website, shoot me an email, and I'll take up that torch. I'm also going to get some other voices in here, get things rolling in that fashion. Thanks for being here. See you next time.